Hi everyone, fashion is one of the first visual impressions that we make of one another, and it helps us further dissect the socio-political landscape of an area over time. This becomes increasingly more important the more that people are censored, which is nothing new. Today we're going to explore how fashion has always been political in America from 100 years ago to the present day. I also talk with my hands a lot, not to be like one of those annoying people, but it does kind of distract from the video, so you will be seeing me come in and out of this screen because, trust me going like this, you don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. So we are going to begin. It looks like I'm speaking into a hairbrush because I had my mic on. I accidentally deleted all of my audio until the 40s, so I will catch up with you then because I don't really like when the audio sounds different. Before we go into the 1920s, we're going to go into the mid-1800s to talk about the women's suffrage movement because it ties back into the 20s. Thanks! Suffrage movement was a decades-long campaign to secure a woman's right to vote in the United States. In the beginning of this movement, many women challenged gender norms by wearing white bloomers. No, not those bloomer shorts that you might be thinking of that are popular right now. No, nothing like that. It was the mid-1850s. Traditional 1800s bloomers wore loose-fitting pants that became a radical fashion expression because at the time, pants were considered an exclusive part of male attire. Wearing bloomers had an immediate affiliation with the suffrage movement. If you wore this as a woman, it would signal to other women and men that you were fighting for this cause. The bloomers movement only lasted for a few years because a lot of men made these ridiculous political cartoons to make fun of them. A lot of black suffragists didn't participate in this outward fashion statement because they weren't able to. A great example of this would be abolitionist Sojourner Truth, who was actually forced to wear pants and bloomers when she was enslaved. So for her, these weren't liberating pieces of clothing and they did not signify the same freedom as it did to white feminists. The white bloomers movement fell out after a couple of years and women reverted to unifying together in the collective uniform of a white dress, which was way more socially acceptable. As the suffrage movement continued into the early 20th century, the white dress remained a powerful political symbol. And after 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed and white women had the right to vote, this symbol still remains a very popular political reference for women in politics. You can see at the State of the Union address in 2019 and 2020, women band together to wear white and honor the suffrage movement. Additionally, in her VP acceptance speech in November of 2020, Kamala Harris also wore a white pantsuit to pay homage to this movement, and Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman elected into Congress. In the 1930s, we had most notably the Great Depression. Fashion was not as often used as a political expression, but a result of the current political state. The Great Depression's stylistic choices showed class divide like never before. The wealthy got wealthier and they had expensive evening wear, most notably the rise of the backless dress. At the same time, the Dust Bowl was happening, which ruined the agriculture of the southwestern Great Plains region of the United States. This led to mass starvation and an extreme loss in income for many American families. In fashion, sacks with food were often covered with fabric so that women would be able to reuse the fabric bags to make clothing for their family. World War II was from 1939 to 1945. We're going to briefly talk about World War II and how the fashion reflected a country away at war. Women were working. All of America's money was going to the war overseas, and women left at home had rations. Utility clothing and female uniforms became popular for the working woman.
Once upon a time, there were beauty parades. All the girls needed was youth and culture. But this is war. California, women welders have a lunchtime contest. Men workers vote on each girl's appearance, job record, and attendance.
Isn't this pretty hot for you, Miss Spillane?
Well, I hear it gets kind of hot around the kitchen stove, too.
I never thought of that.
Women were enlisting to help as nurses during the war, and those who stayed home were sometimes working the jobs of their husbands. They didn't want them to work those jobs at first, and then they realized they actually needed them because nobody else could do it. It also became really popular at the time to make your own clothing. A lot of magazines had demonstrations on how to alter your husband's suits into your own. I don't really know what would happen when they came back, if they did. Because we were a country away at war, red, white, and blue were pretty much everywhere and on anything. This ties into the zoot suit.
I want a suit with the reach, with the drape, the shape, and stuff. Come to look sharp enough.
Zoot suits were made out of wool, and wool was one of the products that we had to ration, so it became illegal and very controversial to wear these. And they were also oversized, so a lot of people were offended that somebody would waste all of that fabric in such desperate times. There are some varying sources on where exactly they originated, but they're said to have grown out of the Harlem jazz community during the Harlem Renaissance in the mid-30s. Zoot suits were worn by many black Americans in Harlem and were quick to grow popularity in California by Mexican Americans, Filipinos, and Japanese Americans. Anybody who wore these suits were considered unpatriotic, and it caused the 1943 Zoot Suit riots in LA. A lot of innocent Mexican Americans in California became targets of law enforcement. Alright, now we're in the 50s, and the men are back. The men are back, guys. It's not a warning, the men are back. And after the war, there was a huge return because of this to how things were. Tradition, housewives, elegance. After the war, the men were home and there was a huge boom in the economy because of it, because we were done spending all of our money on the war.
When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home.
A lot of people were able to afford to buy a home. They had disposable income to shop. There was a big return to tradition in all areas of life in the 50s, and fashion responded to this with an almost immediate emphasis in styles of femininity, elegance, modesty. There were hourglass silhouettes, cinched waist, fuller skirts, all pushed the same idea of a traditional housewife who always had to look polished and ready, even if she was just staying home, which usually she was. Now, in the 1960s, obviously, there's going to be a reaction to the sudden change and switch back to a conservative population. In the 60s, there was a huge rise in what is often referred to by historians as protest fashion, and more than ever, it became abundantly clear that the fashion choices that people would make would directly impact the response they would receive from outside of their community. Civil rights movement had plenty of important collective fashion groups, so we're going to go over a couple. The first one we have, the most notable one, likely by popular culture, would be MLK Jr., and he was with the SCLC, and they were wearing their Sunday best. Sunday best refers to the most presentable and respectable suit and tie look you could wear. Typically, in this case, what you would wear to church. He wanted their message to be taken more seriously and to show that they were worthy of respect. Which, remember, this was a collective fashion movement that was extremely successful, but that success, unfortunately, did not come without the continuous racial violence and police brutality that they experienced. Young black college students would wear denim alongside Southern sharecroppers and working class adults to fight for their rights. They were rebels with the cause, and they were using this fashion choice as their political rebellion. Other young non-black students would support the cause. Many would travel from the north to the south to help them organize, and when they'd go back north, they would wear their blue jeans, their denim overalls, and continue this fashion choice. So a side note for some context, the 60s had what is called a youthquake. There were so many young people, so many boomers, and all of them were willing to put their lives on the line for change. They did not like the way that things were, and they were ready to fight for it. So good for you, I guess. I don't know why they ended up being weird later on, but I don't know. The Black Panther Party of the 60s also had their own collective fashion choices to show their political affiliations, and they were against the idea of dressing up to conform to white standards. They wanted to challenge the white standards, and that included fashion.
In America, black people are treated very much as the Vietnamese people, because we're used, we're brutalized.
Many members of the Black Panther Party dressed unisex to support their uniform cause together. Wore berets, which were a symbol of revolution at the time. They were a part of many military uniforms, specifically the French resistance fighters during World War II, which made the party adopt them as a symbol of nonconformism and resistance against police brutality. The Black Panther Party is also associated with leather jackets in popular culture, but this was mostly out of convenience, as this was something most people already owned. Sunglasses were also worn as a way to help conceal their identities, especially because they were being surveilled by the FBI. And according to the FBI director at the time, he said that they were the greatest threat to the internal security of our country. On their berets and jackets, they often had pinback buttons that would support their causes. These were easily accessible, very cheap to make and mass produce. Going out and protesting was a direct threat to their livelihood because they were being surveillanced. The slipping of a button to other people and sharing their message was a lot more covert and safe. There was also protest fashion to the Vietnam War. Wearing black armbands would be a way that younger people, starting with students, would protest the war in Vietnam. It was a peaceful way to express opposition, but it did start with backlash, with school boards banning them. Kids were suspended, harassed physically and verbally for their stance. The end of the 60s also marks one of the most pivotal moments in queer history, which would be the Stonewall Riots of 1969. Police spontaneously began to raid gay bars in New York City and brutally attack and arrest queer people. Stonewall was actually owned by the mafia at the time, and they would bribe the police, but the police would still enter, and then they would charge people with the solicitation of homosexual relations. Remember that in the 50s and 60s, homosexuality was illegal in 49 states. If you were to be openly queer, you were subject to violence and imprisonment. One thing I do want to add when it comes to the topic of queerness throughout America's history is that queerness will always be political. I think in general, this doesn't just apply to being queer. just existing outside of the traditional norms. Every choice in clothing, when your existence is up for political debate, is political. And the way that you express yourself, whether that's to conform or to be authentic, will always be political when there are people that are questioning the validity of your existence. Fashion, sorry, my computer is messing up, but fashion for the queer community specifically is an amazing way that you can assert your identity and to show yourself. I am queer. I am proud of being queer. I will not conform. I will not hide to the standards of a heteronormative society, to a cisgender world. I will be who I want to be, and you will have to deal with it. And for a lot of trans and gender non-conforming people, every single day your outfit is challenging the gender norm. So that is directly political. Political rebellion is not always really like by choice, if that makes sense. You're not like, today I'm doing this. It's usually not by choice. You're rebelling against something that has been used against you. So that's all I'm saying. I don't really know if that made sense, but I'm just going to continue. Now, during the Stonewall riots, a lot of historians say this is not a written rule or something that they could find any record of. There was something that was called a 3-article rule. It is a suggestion for other people within your community to wear at least 3 pieces of clothing that align with the sex that you were assigned with at birth. And this was to avoid a police raid and also to avoid police brutality. This was really just a warning to each other so that everybody would be able to be safe. Continuing on, we have the 1970s. And the 1970s actually had a group that was slightly inspired by the Black Panther Party, and they were called the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets were a social organization founded in the late 60s by and for Chicano Rights in East LA. They were fighting against police brutality, educational discrimination, and these berets were very similar to the Black Panther Party. They were used to reject the mainstream assimilation into the white media and culture. Coming out of the 60s into the 70s, we have the women's liberation movement. It was for working class and middle class women. It was for radical feminism, and it responded to the counterculture that embraced outdated beliefs about women of all races and sexualities. Romantic styles. They ditched bras, they opted for tube tops. The pantsuit also became very popular. As late as 1978, there were restaurants that wouldn't allow women with pants to enter. Now, pants have been around throughout each decade and worn, but the pantsuit really took off as a megatrend because women wanted to be taken seriously, and it became available at every level of retail.
And pants that fit at $9.49 that glide through the day.
Leading into the 80s in the South Bronx and Harlem, we had the rise of hip-hop culture.
Nothing transforms a person quicker than a garment. Nothing quicker. You put on nice clothes no matter how poor you are or where you come from, and you go downtown, you're just like them.
And I mentioned this briefly in my street style video. I mentioned Dapper Dan. I'm not going to talk a ton about it. I'm going to link the same resources I did there so that you could learn more about this if you're interested. At this time, a lot of Black and Latino Americans would make fashion choices that were associated with hip hop. And each of these clothing pieces served as a visual marker of political resistance to the white mainstream social hierarchy. Hip-hop began to have huge mainstream success, and no matter how wealthy or big that hip-hop artist got, they would still wear street fashion looks from brands that represented the working class. This was a way for a lot of hip-hop artists to clap back and to signal their presence in a lot of places that would traditionally exclude them.
So you might walk into Louis Vuitton and you look down at, especially in 1980s. So you go up to that, you feel at home, and he's going to cater to your needs and take care of you.
I feel like when I think of the 80s, I think of like windbreakers and stuff, which there was a health craze, but there are a lot of other really important political moments, and one of them was Reagan.
Behind is even more important. I take no obligation more seriously.
President Reagan, leadership that's working.
Everybody was going to work. All the younger people were going to work, and this decade defined these terms specifically for women called power dressing, and for men, mostly, it was yuppies. An editorial from October 1985 American Vogue was titled Power Dressing, and it showed women above men who were filling up their gas tanks, cleaning their pools. It said, men can fuel fantasy, but women set the direction and tone. You get the sense that things are changing. The idea of dressing the part became popular. One example is skirt suits with the exaggerated padded shoulders. No matter what you were wearing as a woman, even to this day, a man is always going to figure out a way to sexualize you. So the idea that you still had to dress up like a man as much as you could to succeed in the workforce, the idea still existed of dressing like a man in the workforce in the 80s, but it was beginning to feel like a change was coming. And it also was meant to send a very strong political message that Women belonged in the workforce, women did not have to stay home anymore, and women could have successful careers with financial independence for the first time. One of the biggest political and social issues of the 80s, especially within the LGBT community, was the AIDS crisis.
And people it strikes and that it threatens to explode in the nation's cities.
Federal health officials say as many as 1 million Americans may have been infected with the AIDS virus, and more than 12,000 are expected to develop the deadly disease next year.
Fashion solidarity did play a huge role in fighting the stigma around AIDS and raising awareness, but more importantly, there was a push of conformity for a lot of gay youth at the time because they were going to be stereotyped if they dressed outwardly queer. And like the rest of history, they had to find different ways that they could show other gay people that they were gay. A lot of gay men used ear piercings and in I think the right ear, and other little hints of their sexuality because there was a threat to their sexual expression. To this day, red ribbons are still worn in support of those who have been affected. Punk fashion also was a direct response to the rise of the corporate world in the 80s.
What does your dress mean? What does it say, or does it mean anything, or what?
It's just basically saying, I don't like the way society's run.
Okay, well, that's
a cop-out, everybody's plastic.
Punks were anti-capitalist and rejected a consumer-driven society. They were anti-corporation. There was DIY fashions, slogans, graphics. They called out greed and social injustice. In the 90s, a lot of subcultures of fashion from earlier began to branch out and develop. Goth, metal, and the rise of grunge all opted for a more anti-commercial aesthetic. All of this is a response to the excess of the 80s, the superficiality and the economic uncertainty and the social conformity. Hip-hop continued to develop from the 80s. It became a very dominant force in fashion with every coming decade.
Where did the condoms come from? Where did you all start that?
Some just said, pick up the condom in the safety pin. It didn't, I don't know. Anybody asks you why you're wearing it, just tell them it's for safe sex and start explaining to them. So we kind of took it from there.
Going into the 2000s with the supermodel beauty standard, anytime we are in an economic downturn, we always revert to simplicity when it comes to fashion. Just a response from the exaggerated looks from the 80s, it was also because it didn't matter what you were wearing, it mattered what body was wearing it. As you can tell, it's been many hours later of me looking at a computer screen, but now we're going to go into the early 2000s. And the early 2000s in America, the fashion was heavily influenced by a post-9/11 America. There's a big sense of pride in being an American and to show your political solidarity with America. This was seen as a way to show support for the country and the victims of the attacks. I think it was Ralph Lauren that came out with a show because it was actually during Fashion Week that it happened, so they had to delay a part of Fashion Week, I think. I don't know, I was only one. Wearing the flag and showing your support had an entire different meaning in a post-9/11 America because it was a sign of this collective grief, sort of unity of this traumatic experience and this collective devastation that all of us had, especially in the tri-state area. And while I'm saying all this, I also want to mention that the aftermath of 9/11 looked different for everybody, especially if you were South Asian, Arab, or just looked South Asian or Arab, because people automatically identify you with an organization that you had no part in.
We don't want your kind here. You have to leave. And I was there to ask whether I should be in AP chemistry.
When people looked at me, they looked at the hijab before they looked at anything.
Americans, especially hijabi women, they had to have their identities constantly questioned after this, and they faced a ton of discrimination just because of their religion. And in America, this remains the same for so many religious groups outside of Christianity. Now, in the 2010s, I actually remember this decade, we had some important collective fashion moments. This was worn in the 2017 Women's March. It was a really interesting political fashion choice at a march because apparently there were drones, so the first thing that the drone would see would be your hat. Also, at the 2018 Golden Globes, we had the Me Too movement.
To the power of those men, but their time is up.
This was also a really important time, and a lot of celebrities wore black in solidarity. Now, this one feels honestly ridiculous to talk about, but unfortunately, it's true. COVID-19. In 2020, COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and every single state in the US had different laws for masking. And once some of the mask laws were lifted across the country, continuing to wear a mask in a red state would sometimes, and still does, cause people to be the face of these ridiculous jokes because I guess they decided to take their health seriously when the government didn't. A lot of people continue to mask in support for Maybe they're immunocompromised friends and family. I just cannot believe that this is a debate and actually is taking a political stance, because if you were a part of one party, you were going to wear a mask, and if you were part of another, you were way less likely to wear a mask. And I can't believe this is a thing here. I'm speechless. I'm just going to stop. Now we also have the reclamation of a lot of past politically rebellious fashion statements, things that used to be really dangerous for particular cultural groups to wear. I'm not entirely sure what will be next in fashion. I know a lot of people currently have the debate about the housewife aesthetic coming back. The only thing is that no family can really survive on just one income. So it's never going to have the impact that the 50s did, because nobody can live that way. Most people have a second job and a side hustle. It's just funny because it's the look of a housewife, but you can't be one because you have to go to work. Like, I don't know, you can't do it. You can't do it the same way you did in the 50s. I'll put it that way. Okay, really random analysis here, but one thing I just thought of is that in the 80s we had the health craze and kind of like this fitness thing going on, and then in the 90s we had this super skinny supermodel thing, and low-key that's exactly what just happened. Think about the 2010s. Athleisure was worn like pretty casually and was really popular, and now it's different, to put it in a nice way. Wow, I love how fashion repeats itself. All right, let me know what you thought about this video. I would love to know more collective fashion moments throughout history, especially if you're not American. I want to know. We'll see you all in my next video. I literally have to go to the movies in an hour, and it's 5 o'clock, and I said I was going to upload this today, so I really have to go.